This here is Project Moon's power system. And what I think is fantastic about it is that unlike many shonen power systems that use theirs as a scaling tool or rely on its users coming across some MacGuffin, Project Moon's is about this little thing called humanity. It's a system born out of the inherent meaning and pain that come from being a human. And like the human condition, it's just as capable of corrupting someone as it is being useful to that person depending on how they respond. And I think that's beautiful. However, there's one drawback to that beauty. It's shaped like a virus, and it's spreading. Speaking of, now, I'm not saying it's hard to understand this system on the surface. Most of the system can be explained by saying that if you're mentally well, you get a sick personal weapon called Ego, and if you crash out, you distort into a monster like a TADC character. But while that's easy to understand, it's pretty reductive. In fact, it's so simplified that I'll just call it wrong and an injustice to the world building. So let me give you a full tour of the essentials to PM's magic system, or as I like to call it, the light system. And let's start this sucker off with what separates its setup from even the greats. Ego and Distortions, the big funny words on the thumbnail, those as we know them barely even existed before midway through the series. And unlike a certain other franchise, Project Moon didn't need to throw away its original system in the process of making its most famous one. Instead, we know exactly what the source of this magic is, and that's in... Alright, baseline brass tacks first. The world of Project Moon takes place in this continent-sized metropolis called the City. And fitting to the name, it's dystopia central everywhere except maybe in its version of China. Jury's out there, we'll let them cook. But our tour starts underneath it in a place called the Ruins. Here, you can find a whole hodgepodge of horrors including birds, lighthouses, blue hair dye, and therefore pronouns, and most importantly, the rivers. This body of water runs underneath the entire city throughout the ruins and even into the outskirts beyond the known world. Dubbed the primordial sea of possibility or well of humanity, the waters are said to contain all of human consciousness and all possibilities of the past, present, and future. In other words, it's basically magic water. But not actual magic, no, that's something else. The river has special properties that can manifest in countless ways. For instance, some parts of the river split off into little tributaries or sub-rivers that have their own powers. One example of this is the River of Oblivion, which can suppress the memories of someone's past by drinking it. And considering how something that potent is just one of the infinite possibilities the river can bring, you'd think that people would be clamoring to milk this sucker for all it's worth. But no. Despite being the most potential liquid known to mankind, the rivers are virtually unknown. While there are some factions that choose to explore the ruins for treasure and other mysteries, this is a place mostly lost to time. In fact, the only ways that the poor souls on the surface know about it are from the gaps, where the river exists higher than normal and some effects can be found up top. The most notable of these gaps is in the Black Forest in the outskirts and Wuthering Heights in District 20, and both were brought to ruin by a supposed beast from inside. It ain't something to start counting nickels about, but I thought it was kind of funny. Eventually though, a research team would come upon the river while in the outskirts of the city and attempt to use it to better the world around them. That's cause the city, it's a pretty place to live. Violence is rampant, planes don't exist, and Grubhub drivers explode when they're late. And these researchers are attributing a lot of the source of this suffering to something called the disease of the mind. Now, I talk about it more in this video, but for our purposes, they had the idea that if they could refine the waters of the river into a resource, then every person could manifest the means, and weaponry, to become their best self and reclaim the hope for a better future rather than this trudging, hopeless cycle of suffering they have now. And while it was a nice plan on paper, it proved to be a total wash. But with some gumption, a multi-wing war, and innumerable human sacrifices, that research team founded a new plan and succeeded in turning the waters of the river into a substance called Cogito, which we're gonna put a pin in now but come back to later, promise. Because while Cogito had its uses, the goal was to further refine it into a resource we now call light. The final plan was to cause an eruption of this light so that it would shine for 7 days across the city. The waters of the river would be infused with 10 particular virtues and imbue every person with 2 things. The first was basically spreading Zoloft into the air, giving the population a sense of relief from the drudgery and leave them to think more positively while it was up. And the second was the means to seize a power called EGO. the weaponry and tools born out of their person to achieve those goals. The hope here was that if every person was able to shrug off the dread they held for just long enough, even the most defenseless in the city could wield the power to seize their most honest ideals. And somehow, it worked. Until it didn't. Because the head researcher made their second in command by plugging his dead crush into a fridge called Character AI, which, don't worry, was not the first time he harvested a friend for science, it eventually went off course enough to try and take the light for herself 3 days into the fireworks show. And do you wanna know what this, stopping your meds cold turkey, and the year 1929 have in common? A ding ding, that's right, they end with a violent crash. While the first 3 days were bright at every hour, the final 4 were dark at every moment, and the people felt a greater sense of negativity than before. This back-to-back series of events would become known as the White Nights and Dark Days. But by the week's end, all of the immediate effects leveled out and the sky returned to normal. Except, even if incomplete, this seed of light here had already made its impact on the city. Not only were people acting more honest with themselves now, but they were able to use the power from the well of humanity to draw out their own ego from their ideals. But still, there were some consequences. But first, we gotta take a step back and look at who exactly was running this operation. Now, I ain't got the time to walk you through the candy-colored drama team of 10 here, so let's just talk about the mother and father figures. Johnny X and Jane Bathbaum here were both heads of this project at one point. Jane, aka Miss Sun, aka Carmen, was the original founder and had her vision being that the people in the city should follow their own path and innate desires. So her vision of the light would manifest as a way for people to become the truest form of those. And then Johnny X, real name Abel, Abram, Adam, Twitter. Ian took over once Carmen fell in the bathtub and kicked the bucket. The bucket would then go on to eat her, and Ian would continue with his own vision. He instead thought people should face struggle through reason instead of emotion alone. And eventually, both of them would enter the light by the time the White Nights and Dark Days came to pass. In other words, these two made themselves gods that live inside the light. And that is the series of events that led to the trauma cluster we now know as Project Moon's ego and distortion power system, and allowed people to wield their light to give their mind physical form. All it costs to make use of it is the low price of a single panic attack. Allow me to demonstrate. So, let's say you had the worst day of your life. 2 of your friends died, you forgot how to make fried chicken, and your long-lost brother came back to steal your house. At some point, your poor mind just can't handle that, and all you can see is utter darkness in front of you before a colorful, comforting light. Now at this stage, one of 3 things can happen. Outcome number 1, you can keep panicking and become a sinful little Picatula. We won't talk about that here, but don't worry, boss got you covered. But should you keep your wits about you, you're greeted with the chiming of bells and the voice that launched a war, Carmen. In your darkest moment, she will give you a glimmer of hope. Carmen will tell you about how harsh the world has been to you, how much it's taken from you, and how unfair it is for you to be suffering the way you are. You'll be comforted and asked relentlessly about what it is you truly want, until finally, Carmen will ask you if you are willing to take the means to get it by painting the world in your own colors. And your answer will determine whether you distort or manifest ego. If you answer yes, your body will distort, taking a new shape that reflects your very desires and impulses. But if you answer no, and instead insist on taking matters into your own hands, reasoning beyond only your own desires, you will manifest ego as weaponry or tools on your body. And it's this solitary interaction that the rest of Project Moon's power system unfolds. Because as luck would have it, we have a recorded case of a conversation with Carmen. Well, okay, we have 2 now, but by the time this comes out, the source for both of them will be gone, and this giant germ will at least be archived on YouTube. So we're gonna go the other way and start by talking about... This is Vergilius, also known as the Red Gaze, Verge, the Guide, and formerly as the Fraud. He's a pretty stoic guy that doesn't like unnecessary words or actions. And near the end of his story, Leviathan, he sees the children in an orphanage he desperately tried to save, well, cease to be. And the man responsible, Jumsoon, has just distorted in front of his eyes and also taken out all of his co-workers. This sight is enough to shake Verge to his core and leads to him being accosted by Carmen. And as much as I'd like to show you the entire interaction, well, that would make this video 20 minutes longer. So instead, here's all the essentials and a little taste of how it went.
Your heart looks to be aching. The children you couldn't save are swirling around in your head, aren't they?
I wanted them to live on my behalf. If I could get them to live with the heart I couldn't have, I was sure that even the faintest flow would grow into the sturdiest.
It must have been so difficult, lonesome, suffocating to have such a lofty dream. But you don't have to hide it anymore, because everyone can create by themselves a world they consider right.
A world for myself. What are you talking about?
A world only for your eyes to see. Exactly that. It is to become a self unbound by the eyes and standards of the city.
So I should disregard everything that is in me?
That's right.
Have you always been this way? Driving those trying to reawaken down another path?
I simply ask questions others have never given thought to. And usually, we understand each other. I support and lend them strength, so they can continue on their new path.
A friendly, yet ruthless pressure. Don't look at anything but yourself, and be buried in self-love. It says it'll give me the power to do so. But it would be a thirst that could never be satisfied. Then, wouldn't distorting only prevent you from looking an inch ahead of yourself?
It could be. Still, that interpretation is your idea in color, is it not? As for me, I have my own color, and others have their own color as well. I simply inform them of one more path.
How cowardly. If I went down the path the voice told me, it would surely be pleasurable. But it wouldn't get me to where I want to go. Thus, I have only one way to go. To tread with all the pain and thirst I have experienced until now, and will suffer through again in the future, because only I can do it.
It seems we're going to take opposite paths.
Yes, then go your own way. It, too, must be the color of the person you are.
A crown of thorns to shoulder the burdens of those he has lost. A curtain of blood soaked from the violent path he walks. And a sanguine gladius to carve it further as he follows his great flow. This is the form of Vergilius's ego. And while every single one effloresces the same way, each person's tool is a reflection of themselves and what they stand for. But then, what exactly is ego? Well, the full name for it is Extermination of Geometrical Organ. And if that sounds like a nonsense name, then you've just earned yourself a gold star. Good job! Dante has no idea what the term means. Angela in Library of Ruina simply calls it the physical manifestation of the mind, and nobody that's unaffiliated with the Light Project from Lobotomy Corporation even calls this stuff ego. Everyone on the outside calls it psychoment for psychological equipment. Oh, and while I'm at it, yeah, that's a correction from how I described psychoment in the Distortion Detective video. Here's a full breakdown for those that really care. The ego name itself was coined by Carmen directly, and the closest explanation I can give for why the acronym breaks down this way is from this Reddit user's comment. Read this if you want, but the short version is that since ego is considered the shell of the mind being given physical form, that shell is considered the geometrical organ that is breaking whenever it's manifested. There's also a potential reference to something called geometric psychology, and I'ma be real, 30 minutes of research into that was more than enough to tell that this is some wild-ass pseudoscience. Most likely, PM just wants a funny in-joke that happens to work with their acronym. However, since it's born of the mind, ego can take many forms. Most often, we can see it take the shape of various weapons, conventional or unique, but there have been rare instances where an ego, and distortions for that matter, take the form of a location, the most noteworthy of which is the library, which is revealed to be Angela's own ego at the end of Library library of Ruina. The only constant is that the shape is predominantly of a man-made object, and any physical changes to the person are either aesthetic or in service of using that object. And in most cases, an ego can be activated or withdrawn at will after the first efflorescence. That said, many ego we've been exposed to at length will invoke some kind of mental strain or other limiter that restricts how long it can be active for. And before we go further, there's this connotation that egos had for a while that anyone that's able to manifest it is generally a good guy. Thankfully, that's been debunked in the past year. Ahoy! Because as we can see in Limbus, manifesting ego just means that you're finding a way to stay true to your own convictions at length instead of giving in to shutting out the world around you. Many of the cases we've seen are of people acting conventionally virtuous, but morality's not the priority here. Because if you truly see your future at its brightest by killing your old friend or harvesting a timepiece to settle a score with a whale, then Carmen's not gonna stop you from getting some toys to play with. At the same time though, this isn't the only way someone can make use of ego. It turns out there are like a half dozen ways someone can get a hold of Psychoment. It's just that the other 5 on this list need some additional context. So now that we've got a handle on the basics of ego, let's go to the other side of the coin and talk about... Going back to our previous example, Vergilius had a special talk with Carmen that led to him manifesting his ego. But the current source of his problems, Jumsoon, went the other direction. Instead of rejecting Carmen, he accepted her ideals and embraced seeing the world as his artful pointillism paradise. Cause look, it's the Ring. They're only gonna make so much sense on a good day, and this clearly was not one of them. But while we know how Jumsoon made that final leap into becoming a blue-spotted scaly, his distortion was already progressing even before the events of Leviathan, the story he appears in. In fact, even if over 99% of the city hasn't interacted with Carmen, the vast majority of residents are affected by the distortion. And the evidence comes from an expert on the topic. Moses is the titular distortion detective and main character of her side story. As you might imagine, her job is to understand and mitigate the effects of the distortion phenomenon, which is the name of what causes people to talk with Carmen in the first place. Unlike most people though, Moses is capable of seeing the effects of the distortion others won't. I go more in depth on this story at... You get it. But all you need to know here is that under Moses' eyes, every person she encounters shows some signs of it. For instance, 2 of her colleagues may either appear to have a mask on their face or bee-wings on their back without even needing to fully transform in the way Jumsoon did. And we come to learn that Moses has defined 4 stages for a distortion to take. Those are the incubation period, early stage, middle stage, and terminal stage. The incubation period is a fancy way of referring to any normal person in the city. Moses will see small fragments of a distortion in this phase, like the aforementioned mask, but there's no sense of form they have beyond it. All this means is that this person has the potential to distort at some point in their lives. In this state, Moses is still the only person that can see the effects, but it's easier for the traits to be more finite to her. For instance, those bee-wings on her colleague Vespa's back would not just be visible to her, but also generate a breeze she can feel. It's also likely that this progressed because Vespa was around the thumb at the time, which causes him to feel an irregular amount of distress. Now, unfortunately, the next 2 stages don't have explanations as Moses was cut off before being able to describe them, but we can still make some inferences based on her past experiences. Just know that this may very well change in time. All I ask is for your patience and hey, maybe consider subscribing to the channel or becoming a patron. You ever notice we don't have a consistent source of lore in this community? Sure, there's some channels that make one-offs and literary breakdowns and a half dozen gameplay channels. All effort well spent, of course, no one can take that away from anyone. But the biggest mission I've got going into 2026 is to make sure we finally have a repository for every major part of Project Moon's world building. Seriously, nobody else is going this hard into the lore, and after doing this for several years now, I really get why, since PM loves being cryptic. But ever since I started getting help with editing these with the Sin and Shin update, that's become all the more possible, and the extra folks subscribing, joining on Patreon, and yeah, becoming members has made a huge difference. We still have a long ways to go, but if you join, you'll get access to the essays earlier, the essential credits, and I'll answer your questions in an outro Q&A. In any case, y'all know the drill, I've said my piece, so let's talk about something you're not quite as familiar with, like say, the paint lizard. The middle stage is most likely the point we see jump soon in, where the distortion has taken form. The subject has gone from simply being distressed to surrendering to the influence of Carmen and now is clearly altered to the common person. This is another instance of their mind taking shape, but instead of tools to supplement them, the entire body is transformed into something typically animalistic or otherworldly. And as Angela mentions in Library of Ruina, the stronger the desires they hold when agreeing with Carmen, the stronger the distortion. It's also worth noting that a single distortion can be made out of more than one person, like in the case of the mock exam in Distortion Detective. However, it is still very possible for them to revert to their original state unless they progress to the terminal stage. And as the name implies, this is the stage where there's no going back from being distorted. Now, anything beyond that involves some screwy power system mechanics, so let's put a pin in the terminal stage for now and let them longingly gaze at us. But this means that from the middle stage, there are several directions a person can take. One option is for the person to return to being a regular human. This is typically done by the patient rejecting the idea that made them distort in the first place and either surrendering it or otherwise returning back to their old mentality. Using similar language to ego, this is the process of tearing down the wall they have constructed around their heart. Distortion Detective is full of cases like this, while Limbus Company and Dante have gotten gradually better at this over time, though it's usually served with a healthy dose of blunt force trauma. But then there's this other dynamic at play. See, it's not only possible for someone to get better after distorting, they can outright skip right over to manifesting ego if they've got a big enough change of heart against Carmen. The primary example we have of this is Dong Rong, who initially distorted in Kanto 4. Originally having broken down due to seeing himself undeserving of the vast number of rewards he was given in his time working at K-Corp, he denied that there was any path forward to him and gave himself up to his feelings of emptiness. This is what led to him becoming Dong Rong Who Denies All. But with some percussive maintenance by the LCB, he would evolve that line of thinking and instead commit to his need for recognition in his work, cutting down everyone he knew in the past to manifest his farm wash ego. The first form was born out of feeling a void within himself, while the second came to form when he found a way to move past that void. Now, of course, Dong Rong didn't have a chance to relapse on that choice due to him having a case of very short lifespan, but even if he had lived longer, he wouldn't have had to worry about distorting ever again. Probably. That's because while a person could feasibly distort several times, once a person fully manifests ego, they become totally immune to the distortion phenomenon. Fully being the key word here, because that leads us into our second form of manifesting ego, volatile ego. Volatile ego are identical to ego as we know it in most ways. They come from the same Carmen interview, they manifest as tools on a person, and they can be retracted at will, well, if the person ever has time to do that anyway. Because unlike the complete manifestation of ego, also called efflorescent ego, the people who manifest volatile ego didn't really commit. Volatile ego is what you get when you reject Carmen, but do so with some doubts in mind. Cases of this are exceedingly rare to the point we only have 2, technically 3 of them. And the only one most folks are familiar with is the case of Philip. While Philip initially responded to Carmen at his lowest by standing up and saying, "Hey, maybe I am selfish, and it's alright if I'm mad these librarians killed my family," he more so gave himself an argument to ignore Carmen's words rather than reject them. And Carmen, well, she doesn't take well to half measures. So even if Philip and Phil Claire got their 1,000-degree knives for a bit, nothing was preventing them from being thrown to the clowns and having a bad time. Distortion Detective also has its own example in the case of Ezra, who is both distorted and later manifested a volatile ego during a fight with Vespa. And the reason we know that her ego is volatile is due to the fact that Moses can still see signs of the distortion on her after it's manifested, unlike on herself or Urea, who fully manifested their own ego. Of course, a person is capable of transitioning from a partial or volatile ego state into a full one, so long as they eventually reject Carmen entirely. But until then, her temptations won't leave their mind so easily. There's good reason it's called a volatile state after all. And just like there are several ways to manifest ego, there's another way to distort someone if you really want to. With the downfall of Lobotomy Corp came two remnants left behind by the wing. The first is the Monoliths. Originally appearing in Distortion Detective, these are black boxes of all sizes that manipulate people's distortions. And their powers are more varied than you might think. Generally speaking, any person that comes into close proximity with the Monolith is immediately at a greater risk of distorting, such is the case with Bamboo-Hatted Kim. In Limbus, the process is as simple as flipping a switch to distort whoever's closest to it. But in Distortion Detective, there are two instances in which a monolith is used which are different from what we've seen in Limbus. The first is a mass distortion of 108 people in the Tai Young Produce Company in N-Corp's backstreets. Here, a white smoke billowed out of the monolith that absorbed incubated and early distortions Moses noticed in these people before creating a giant hulking creature that the team has to destroy. And later on, nearly the opposite happens. A monolith the size of a pebble was used for a monthly ritual sacrifice in Quercus Village. One person would be randomly selected to absorb all of the minor signs of distortion across the whole village until they fully distort, and then get locked in a basement forever. Now, I would judge, but if you're living in District 8, you're basically betting on not falling out of your home every month, so is this really that much worse? All of that is to say that we don't have a full consensus on what all the monolith is capable of and how it works. But if you gotta distort someone quick, you can absolutely use Carmen at home to do it, or turn them into a vacation if they're that much of a pushover. Hell, Limbus Company even sells these things for the right price. However, there is one major difference in a monolith-caused distortion and a naturally occurring one. The natural ones get some privacy. Yeah, according to Kanto 6, a distortion caused by talking directly with Carmen and not her little soundboards comes with an emanating force that prevents people from interfering. But DoorDash distortions here ain't protected, which is why Merceau can cut the signal Duke caught onto in Yowieville. Oh, and technically, we don't know for sure that the efflorescent immunity applies to monoliths. Look, it probably does. All I'm saying is that no one's really tried to target a naturally made ego user with a tungsten McDonald's kiosk. But hey, I'm sure some curious fella in District 20 is more than capable of finding out. Let's move away from dark industry though and get to the more natural looking second remnant of Lobotomy Corporation, the Golden Boughs. And let's throw out another quick spoiler warning. The Golden Boughs are, in short, the essence of L-Corp's technology. And considering how we could easily call L-Corp Light Corp, they have some effects. But there have been several occasions where a person has transformed significantly under their influence in a similar manner to distorting. Now, the wiki may claim that whatever happened with Cromer was her distorting, but I'm not convinced. These transformations don't really match the trends set by ego and distortions as we know them. Again, one's more industrial, showing products of human invention even if nature is involved in some way, and the other is more about the human totally losing themselves to something alien, animalistic, and tends to remove the original human from the design. These though? Honey, these are Cronenbergs. These are the people with the bow getting more and more human shoved into the same body and design. Sure, they can come with some accessories, but even with only Cromer and Jamu as examples, it feels to me like this is a third category of transformation. Some kind of wild-ass monkey's paw modification closer to whatever made Tomari or the puppets. But to be thorough, there is a single mention of the word distortion in Jamu's passives, so this very well could count. But at the time of writing, the Golden Boughs are still screwy and undefined enough that I'm gonna call this a toss-up. And with that, we have now covered every means in which a person can distort and recover from it. All that's left is to pull out that pin from earlier. Jesus Christ, wait, you bleed from there? All right, hold on, I got this. Can we get a blood bag on aisle 6? Thank you. All right, so let's talk about how a distortion gets worse. As mentioned, the terminal stage is a point of no return for distortions where they can no longer transform back, and is not specifically defined in canon. So yeah, we're extrapolating here. But there are two instances in Project Moon where someone has double-dipped their distortion. The first is the very end of Library of Ruina. The Reverberation Ensemble is a syndicate made up of mostly distorted people and the Blue Reverberation himself. After their first failed attempt to take over the library, the ensemble bubble are the first to be released from it in Angela's Giant Apology Light Show Jamboree. And due to their proximity and, let's say, appreciation for the light, they're the only instance of a character double distorting in Project Moon. Other than the designs being choice as all get out, and all the more extreme to their philosophies, this isn't something that would usually happen. It's closer to a contamination than a conventional part of the distortion life cycle. In other words, if they spawned out in District 21 like the Molar office did, there's a strong chance these guys would have appeared in the same way they came in. But even if that were the case, they could have still transformed again without any need of the light. And that's because all distortions eventually succumb to one fate. Some parties claim that it's only a matter of time passing, while others think that a distortion will only last until its deeply held worldview is shattered a second time. But every terminal distortion is destined to become an abnormality. Sorry, let me rephrase that. All distortions are destined to become... Woo, yeah! Ain't no way we can cover everything about ego and distortions without getting the SCP involved, know what I mean? Abnormalities may as well be the third leg of Project Moon's light power system, since both ego and distortions are ingrained deeply into it in some way. So, it's only fitting that we include an in-depth look into how they work too. With that in mind, y'all ever brew a cup of coffee with a pour over and then pour the coffee back into it so that it's double caffeinated? Yeah, from the evidence at hand, that's what abnormalities are like to distortions. They're doubling down on rejecting humanity. Originally introduced in Lobotomy Corp, abnormalities are creatures that, with some exception, were all once human, but due to a variety of light-related chicanery, became creatures that may share some traits with the people they originally were, but contain no real thoughts or memories of the original human and happen to all be immortal. Yeah, anytime these suckers are killed, they turn into eggs and eventually reform back into their original state. As for how they're made, well, let's go back to our familiar example. So, Vergilius again, as we know, he got ego, Jumsoon got a fancy distortion, and then they fought. In this fight, Verge quickly deals a blow so pinpoint accurate that it was enough to shake Jumsoon and challenge his worldview again. And all he can do is just stand there, expressionless. Verge, not wanting to be reckless, waits. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait until two giant saw blades and an impossibly large metal body erupt from Jumsoon's stomach and start threatening Verge in Jumsoon's place. This is the only instance we have of a distortion becoming an abnormality. And in case I was too vague before, yes, the attack Verge landed really did do enough psychic damage to disturb him and didn't just cause this abno to appear because he was defeated. I'm sparing you those details because it's an entire anime action scene argument about dots. But from this, we can see where one source of abnormalities lies. Jumsoon was a man who was obsessed with being able to observe everything, including every possibility in existence. The abnormality he became, commonly known as Schadenfreude, is best defined by having an oppressive gaze without even needing to look someone's way. It's Philandersization as a power-up. And while I have thoughts on the implications of this, there's a bigger elephant in the room. Hey, Future Frey here. I actually want to talk about those implications now because this scene throws up a major question about abnormalities. Remember back when we were talking about how you could go 3 ways when you get into panic mode in the city? Well, the first method, becoming a Pacatula, is for people that can't even distort or manifest ego. And one of the major differences in these guys is that they are largely generic. Outside of falling into one of the several sin categories they have, they aren't any kind of unique transformation at all. And the reason that's important is because all throughout Lobotomy Corp and Limbus Company, it's both heavily implied and explicitly stated that every abnormality is unique. You don't get 2 people transforming into the same one. Now, there are some arguments to be made about what is and isn't a reliable narrator in this context, but if the game is going to keep up with this narrative for this long, I feel like it's reasonable to say that they intended for that to be true. Since Schadenfreude was an abnormality that existed in Lobotomy Corporation and the events of Leviathan take place after the wing fell, this implies that abnormalities being unique isn't some kind of rule. And just to further complicate things, Leviathan even has Verge's own internal monologue act like a setup to Jumsoon making this transformation. So what, does that mean that one of these two is wrong about how abnormalities work? Maybe. But there could be another answer, one that still says that all abnormalities are unique and that distortions can become abnormalities if they're mentally broken a second time. For that to happen, we just need to say that this isn't what happened with Jumsoon. And boy, I didn't think we'd be talking about this guy so much, but his reason for distorting factors hard into why he could summon out Schadenfreude. This guy, he is obsessed with the multiverse and observing every possible reality out there. And when he distorted, all of the dots he created on his body are meant to show people visions of these mirror dimensions just like he wanted. So it's possible that, in a moment of despondency, he could have pulled out of one of these infinite possibilities an abnormality that was similar to him, kind of like a certain bus we all know about. It just happened that this thing was violent enough to give him the worst C-section imaginable and be the last thing Jumsoon ever did. Is it just a theory? Oh, absolutely. But if the alternatives are that abnormalities just aren't unique, which makes them feel much less interesting in my opinion, or that Leviathan is wrong, which would also suck, this feels like the explanation that makes the most sense. Not total sense, but the most. Anyway, that's my rant. We got plenty more to talk about. Because this ain't the way most of y'all have been told that abnormality is come into existence, is it? These guys have 3 ways of being born, let's say. The first, we've already covered. The second is what led to the vast majority of abnormalities to come into existence. That would be refining the river's waters with what would become Lobotomy Corp's own technology and, unfortunate learning experiences to become the bucket. This bucket, which happens to be the soup using the nerve broth of Carmen, would be the means the team refined the river water into a substance called cogito so it would no longer kill humans when injected. The company's business model would then revolve around injecting that refined cogito from the bucket into comatose humans, which would transform them into abnormalities as we know them. This is in part why Carmen is called the mother of all abnormalities and is still the origin of 90% of abnormalities in existence. Then there's the last source. So funny thing about LobCorp, abnormalities coming from people is supposed to be this big mid to late game twist. And up until then, the cover was that they just found abnormalities out in the wilderness and started containing them one day. Well, it turns out there was a kernel of truth to that because that's where the last category of abnos come from. Sometimes there are gaps in the rivers which lead to oddities naturally forming, and some abnos formed in the areas where those gaps were present. The best example of these is the 3 birds that were originally in the Black Forest. Speaking of, some abnormalities can also come as a set or theme, even having offshoots that were once called aberrations, but no longer use that name for legal reasons. And we're gonna glaze right over that because outside of the birds, there's little to no reason for any of these things to exist. The Magical Girls in Oz crew weren't some kind of after-school club pre-cogito. The closest we have is the duos which have their own light explanations. Yin and Yang from LobCorp talk like they're the same being that was split and were always abnormalities, while the Merc and the Wolf here imply that the original Merc could have known the original Wolf when she was 15. But this is hardly enough to make a rule or pattern with, so consider those mysteries that we may get the answer to later in life. Instead, how about we address the hard work that researchers have put into understanding abnormalities? Because look, we've already gone this far, and I sure as hell am not gonna go back a year later and re-explain abnormalities unless something major drops. So we're just gonna go the whole 9 yards today and talk about classifications. These are the funny little ciphers that act as the clinical name for the abnormality to all the suits. And hey, I get it. If LobCorp's gonna play Cabin in the Woods, they may as well have an easy way to tell how useful or dangerous each monster is. As such, classifications are broken down into 2 components. You've got your risk levels and then your classification codes. Risk levels are the part you're probably more familiar with. They're the color-coded Hebrew tier list that tells you how strong something is and how much energy it produces. It's a system so good they slapped it onto other kinds of ego too, though, say it with me, we'll get to those in due time. Yeah! The weakest level is Zayin and refers to the mostly safe abnormalities. These guys will usually stay in their little boxes in LobCorp and can be either beneficial for the agents that work with them, or have the kindness to raise 12 flags before you're at risk of someone dying, though fans of The Last Supper may challenge that notion. Teth is the next level up, and when abnormalities start breaking out and need some tough love before they start working again. They might kill an agent or 2 if they're fresh or unprepared, but you're probably fine if you've got that one weirdo that likes kicking murderers, crayon drawings, children, dogs, Okay, maybe that's just causing a different problem entirely. Hey, abnormalities are the most middling around that aren't a huge issue to experienced managers, but can cause major problems for everyone else. They'll break out and often cause some more environmental or gimmicky effects. I mean, look at these three. You're really gonna tell me you're molting hard at the idea of taking them, you disgusting little caterpillar? Yeah, I'm talking to you! Get out! Have some respect for the veterans! Vav abnormalities are my personal favorites. They're strong enough to be a risk for an entire department's worth of agents, but make significantly more energy on average. The only trouble is that these abnos and above are at a power level that make them harder to manage when interacted with repeatedly. So you can't get by just having reliable agents to keep them contained. And personally, I think it's more fun to let the reverse shark boy go water skiing every once in a while. Lastly, we have Aleph abnormalities, which are the rarest and greatest threat to their surroundings. Between being the living embodiment of a pandemic, the worst horse imaginable, or just a nice little dog that gets so excited to see you every once in a while, that's all it is. All of these are capable of destroying a facility single-handedly. Hell, some of them may even leave you wishing it was destroyed. Either way, if you see the word Aleph on something, take it seriously. Oh, what, now you're stealing valor? There are only 2 good Aleph dogs in this world, and you are not one of them! This thing's barely even a hay, considering that it's a Kanto 1 boss that needs 2 forms and a scripted event to get a single kill. Get the hell out of here! Though to be fair, that's kind of the trend for non-Lob Corp abnormalities. In Limbus, the first abnormality of the Sinner's fight is a Vav, but its strength level doesn't match up at all with these interpretations. Now, that's in part because Lob Corp had a means to keep abnormalities, let's say eepy for now, and as the first abno the LCB faced, they were still shaking off some of that grogginess. But the thing is that LobCorp made these risk levels factoring in a lot of criteria. It wasn't just the risk of death, though that often correlated, but also the amount of energy and capacity the abnormality had to escape that led to them getting these rankings. So in a world where we don't really care about energy, and the abnormalities have escaped by default, well, the math just wasn't adding up anymore. Thankfully, the LCE managed to do something about that. Near the top of this year, we got an extra number to the right of the risk level that is specifically for combat purposes. It runs on a 1 to 8 scale right now, and almost certainly has a higher cap as we keep going through the Inferno. 1 represents an abnormality that's basically harmless.
In lore, I cannot see that enough.
To 8, which is abnormalities that are easily a threat to most people. Again, even this won't reflect exactly in gameplay, but hey, it's not like any of us are strangers to Project Moon having vague rules with exceptions now, is it? Which brings us to the classification codes. These are the funny 4 sets of characters that are beside the risk level. And I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, we don't really know what half of these are. The GG Wiki suggests that the 4th set is just there so that no 2 abnormalities have the same code, and the LobCorp Wiki has some inklings about what the second characters are, but nothing conclusive. But beyond that, we'll have to make do for the 1st and 3rd row for now. The 1st set is a reference to the source or origin of the abnormality, kind of like their theme. F is for abnormalities that are connected to folklore and legends, T is for trauma, mainly related to experiences from within the city itself, M is allegedly for mythology, at least that's what tracks for the Doomsday Calendar, and then O is a catch-all for everything else, whether they're naturally born abnos or simply aren't associated to the first 3 categories. Oh, and I guess there's also D for the donor abnormalities from Lobotomy Corp. That's less of a lore thing and more of a funny little Easter egg, so good job being a part of history, I guess. You'll use these to get an idea of what the pre-abno person went through, and researchers can use these to see what kinds of employees would work best with them. Then the 3rd code is connected to where the abnormality is from, namely the district. This one's kinda iffy because it bounces between being where the LCB originally saw them and where the abno itself is from. Like, the Fairy Festival's a great example where the LCB technically fought it in the library in District 12, but since that was during Season 4, it got the code 20 representing T-Corp. I don't know, it's pretty inconsistent overall, so maybe we'll get another overhaul someday. At the same time, ain't nothing wrong with theory crafting, because much like old crackpot theories, abnormalities age like a fine wine, and ingrain themselves into their surroundings at that. Have you ever noticed that when you fight an abnormality in a mirror dungeon, that you're in a space that seems to be perfect for it? That's no coincidence. Given time to settle in any given space, an abnormality will change its environment to fit its needs. We've seen this not only in the various dungeon encounters, but also in the third Walpurgis night where the LCB sees the fairy festival after it's had time to steep itself inside of a book. The only reason this didn't happen in Lobotomy Corp is because each of those mongrels were kept inside a clip-off deterrent containment unit. That's a fancy name for the system the wing had that would make the Abnos lethargic and not as ready to attack people so long as they could be kept in their cubbyholes. As you all know, it wasn't perfect. You can't totally suppress them, and each Abno takes their painkillers differently. But since the company needed to extract energy from their minds, abnormalities couldn't be made totally comatose when employees worked with them. If they did, it would defeat the purpose of generating those energy boxes in the first place. And that will just not do, because those boxes are how we get to our third kind of ego. Do you ever want your clothing to whisper to you? Have you thought of owning a gun that runs on intrusive thoughts? Are you a furry into mind break? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you would get some use out of Ego Gear, the product of giving the mind of abnormalities physical form and refining it into stable tools. Keep that definition in mind, it'll be important later. But simply put, Lobotomy Corp would use the energy generated from the abnormalities to process better gear for their employees. One pool of energy goes to the public, and another pool is kept and labeled with the specific abno's name. The more a specific abnormality was worked with, the more weapons and armor it could create. The only catch is that it comes with the abnormality you're living rent-free in your head for as long as you're using it. But is that really so bad? Unlike Carmen, the abnormality won't try to have a full-blown conversation with you to get you to do something. Sure, it may drone on and wax poetically like a video essayist, but hey, they're just stimming. This is a one-sided chat. They're not gonna respond to anything you say and will just keep repeating the same ideas over and over. So as long as you can tune out the ever-present brain rot between your ears, you'll be fine. But if you're just not able to find peace, or you get the gear of an abno that's way out of your league, then the equipment will start to wear you instead. Ego Corrosion is the name of this phenomenon, and the longer you use an ego gear, the more susceptible you are to succumbing to it. We've seen a few cases of this, like in the oh-so-pitiful talisman Sinclair, who got so obsessed with cursing people that an engineer had to take his crayons away. Lean too far into those intrusive thoughts, and the corrosion will consume you in no time. But if you have a good amount of temperance, you can stave off the consequences and have more minor symptoms, like with LCE EGO Song. His corrosion's more of a quirk and has him taking on some of the mundane traits of the Fey Lantern's ego, like pulling pranks and luring people over to him with fairies. But given time, or another user that's less capable of blocking out those thoughts, you'll eventually need to take it off if you want to keep your sense of self. Tally Sinclair's Uptie story really puts it best. It may only be natural that using someone else's mind like a tool gradually assimilates yours into it. But what if I told you there was one instance where the person consumed the abnormality instead? That would be our fourth kind of ego, and it belongs to none other than... Way back to before Ego, Distortions, and LobCorp as we knew it ever existed, Carmen and her team were in the middle of testing the effects of Cogito and managed to extract a sword from a person using it. And while that could imply that abnormalities existed even back then, I'm sure there's nothing we need to worry about. All that's important is that Carmen got this sword with red flesh and giant staring eyes and gave it to a woman named Kali. Consider her the head of security for the research team. Now, Kali was a force in her own right. Raised in the backstreets, still with hope and morality and shit, with a lot of power to back it up. Like body, like mind, she was able to stave off the thoughts coming from this mimicry sword and make use of it to both protect who she cared about and further Carmen's research. But then, the voice evolved. It wasn't trying to convince Kali of anything, of course, but it gradually went from speaking in grinding noises to actual words. And eventually, it spat out a specific question.
Don't you desire a human shell as well?
Already pushing away the mundane thoughts as is, this question led her to reconsider her life choices. Even if Kali never provoked anyone, she undoubtedly had to cut many people down for the sake of self-defense and to protect those around her. And that begged the question, was her one life really worth all of the lives lost in turn? And for only a moment, she considered that if she kept washing away blood with blood, all that would be left of her is a blood-stained shell. She collapsed. Her body fell, but her mind didn't. Kali was already told from the get-go that if she let the weapon overwhelm her, she would be in danger. From Carmen's words, she remembered her promise. Those honest, virtuous eyes she always held. No matter how much she was publicly mocked for her vision, or how much those around her would fear, Carmen never stopped looking ahead to lead them all the same. If Kali could protect a person like that, just one person, then maybe the world around her could change in turn. Soon, her thoughts began to clear, her body began to burn, and before she knew it, she was no longer at risk of losing herself to the sword, and was coated in solid armor. The Ego Gear now fused with her own shell being given physical form, she would finally manifest a dense, red mist. And the rest? Well, the rest is history. All that to say, there's a way to turn an Abnormalities ego into your own. The process seems to involve either efflorescing your own ego while using the gear, or having your conflict be brought on by the abnormality itself. All we can really say is that this fused ego is the only efflorescent manifestation that doesn't need you to talk with Carmen directly, or at least talk with her in the moment. And if that's the case, for all we know, the Monoliths might be putting you in touch with someone else too. Voiceless or not though, this just goes to show that ego of any kind fall under the same name for a reason. But that isn't to say they're made equally. Cause it's not like we're done talking about Ego Gear. No, we got 3 different companies that tried their hand at making it, and you can bet your depressed, morning, sun-showered ass that each comes with their own quirks. So, how about we start off with All Reliable? Yeah, that All Reliable name isn't a joke, because Lobotomy Corp EGO are the most stable of all 3 kinds of Ego Gear we know. Anybody can pick up these babies, try them out in the hallway, and generally have a good grip on them. They're also the ones that are the least prone to corrosion. Now, a part of that is because they intentionally keep their form as gear instead of allowing the tools to leach into the user. And while corrosion itself can do that, LobCorp was thoughtful and strict enough to know that certain employees shouldn't use certain calibers of gear and didn't let their agents go overboard. They're also the only Ego Gear we know of that are confirmed by Bina to be claimable as their own ego by the user. Of course, none of the employees in the wing were capable of this. That's why the Red Mist is the only case of this happening up to now. But all in all, you can think of these things as a safe, reasonable sedan. It may not be sexy, but it'll do the job and you can tell what you're getting into with it. And just like driving a regular car, you're eventually gonna share the road with someone blaring their custom horn and an engine louder than Bremen's tantrums. That kind of ego we like to call... If there are 2 permanent truths about the LCE, it's that they're the biggest geeks in Project Moon so far, and more extra than Verge during the Wild Hunt. Getting a hold of a few of the Abnos from an L Corp branch, these guys saw some of the research from the Wing's Ego Gear and said, nah, we can do better. But to their credit, they kinda did. While these Ego aren't capable of plugging and playing, allowing the user to claim them and have a higher risk of corrosion, the LCE Gear trades that in for a little mechanic called attunement. At any point, the wearer of these Ego can take on additional traits of the abnormality, like the wings and scales LCE Faust has with her Ardor Blossom Star Ego Gear. This can be done by the user understanding and maintaining a higher level of empathy for the abnormality to allow the gear to have a greater influence on them. In gameplay, we usually see this in the animations on the IDs, but it's in this greater amount of control that the LCE wanted to make Ego Gear feel more like Ego itself. Just don't try to stay in that higher attunement level for too long. The only reason this works, after all, is because you're allowing the abnormality to have more influence over you. So if you don't want to corrode quickly, you better know when to shut that off. Unfortunately, the LCE's already lost a chunk of researchers that went the way of Icarus and exploded into well-braised bite-sized pieces. But if nothing else, I gotta appreciate the risk-reward nature of these Ego and would probably pick the LCE's version over any of the other kinds. But there does come an issue when an inventor either has too much fun when designing Ego Gear or just had too much to drink. And we can kinda see that in... If I had to compare these to a car, these Ego Gear are the 50-year-old antique that looks like it's a pain to drive, but has that near-zero turning radius that makes it hard to totally write it off if you're mad enough to swerve with it and shoot your friends with a gun. Corp EGO Gear has more in common with the LCE than Corp's in that you can't just throw it on and expect everything to work. We may only have 3 examples at the time of writing, but all of them come with the passive Ego Corrosion Corp, which causes the user to lose SP, get stronger, and eventually take damage the longer the fight goes on. On top of that, the hater boys get their own extra passives that technically can make them stronger, but are debuffs 90% of the time. So we can see from the text of both of these that you're gonna have an especially bad time using these Ego when you're starting out, but on the bright side, they at least count as having some kind of attunement. Just don't mix up the Volatile on the passive for the Philip and Ezra kind. At the time of writing, they're totally unrelated. Now, we may not know a ton about these Ego, but there are some theories as to how they came to form. The predominant one being that Corp made use of alternative methods to quickly jerry-rig Ego Gear together for the sake of keeping up in their arms race against the LCB. Whatever they did though, it sure feels like the kind of homework a kid submits by spending the night schmoozing up ChatGPT, if you know what I mean. But then again, maybe the AI really is taking human jobs. Yeah, these Ego have one perk that the other 2 companies really could do with. They give the wearer plot armor. As the end of the fight, neither Juan the Grabby Gawker or Goo Buckshot Roulette here can die. They just get some kind of force field that seems really handy for every Ego Gear to have. My best guess as to how they do this is that Corp has some separate tech for their League of 9 to use based on Corp Ryoshu's Uptai story, so it might be an extra tool installed on top of their Ego instead of a trait specific to Corp's Ego Gear itself. I mean, after all, the Sticking Goons didn't have that luxury. So if you're in the market for some kind of weaponry and really don't mind the golden suit giving you a complex if it means surviving a gunshot, then these could be the Ego for you. And far be it for me to judge someone's fashion choices. But what if you're not really in tune with an abnormality, but just want a little bit of that juice they got? A freaks with benefits one-off deal, if you will. Well, you might want to consider whether you have commitment issues. Again, judgment-free zone. But there is still a kind of Ego that'll help you out. If you really think about it, empty Abno encounters are just mini visual novels with a fight-or-flight mechanic. And you might have noticed that both in story and when grinding, that each of these Abnos comes with their own personal Ego gift. Hey, sometimes several! These are little trinkets that share some traits with the abnormality they're from, and they appear in some form across all 3 games. Because even if Library of Ruin is playing coy about it, their battle symbols are basically Ego gifts. While they may have different ways they're used and obtained, all Ego gifts are pretty literal in nature. You get these by doing something that makes the abnormality become fond enough of you to give you a present, and in exchange for not being as potent, there's no risk of corroding. It's pretty fitting, considering how much these things are obsessed with their one fixation. No wonder they'd be happy to share it. In Limbus, the process of getting a gift is pretty simple. Make the right dialogue option with the right stats, and pop goes the brazen bull, you've got a fancy new coin. Or, if you've got resting 10 minutes to midnight face, you could make the burning torture victim watch you and all of your friends drink water, get them to attack you, and then steal not only the coin, but the essence of their pain itself. You fucking sociopath. That kind of behavior wouldn't fly at all in Corp proper. Like with the Ego Gear, you can get gifts by doing work with the abnormality, but these instead have a low % chance to drop and give you some little accessories. Yes ma'am, you get that hairpin. Yes sir. You rock that monocle. Both of those will look great on your resume, especially when I need someone to handle the most insufferable sounds known to man. They'll give minor buffs to agents and change their appearance slightly. Now, while I can't discount the buffs for being functional, I personally consider the appearance change to be the more useful aspect, solely because any agent that's gotten chummy with one of these Abnos is usually a good fit to be assigned to them in the long term. But then again, Corp's the only game where rapid decision making is important, so we can think about more than numbers here. And while everyone's favorite basement arbiter says that having a large number of Ego gifts on your person at once can cause you to start losing your sense of self, we haven't seen anything of the sort up to now. But hey, never say never, right? And then there's the case of that quirky gated community in the outskirts. Battle symbols are basically Library of Ruina's Ego gift replacements. They're closer to Corp's Ego gifts in that they're gotten from repeated use of an abnormality's pages. Library of Ruina's got a funky setup where they've got abnormalities, they're just kept in books and only their essence leaks out. So their influence is limited enough that the battle symbols only work 5% of the time. And I guess that makes sense since these are basically homeopathic abnormalities, and for good measure, battle symbols aren't limited to abnormalities in LOR. Again, the library is a freaky place where anyone put into books follows similar rules, so these are more ego gifts in association than gifts proper. Now that all said, this literary chicanery is what allows for the 5th kind of ego to appear. That's the book manifestations. These are egos specifically from the library, where the amount of light has been realized enough on the floor with high enough emotional energy for the abnormality to feel comfortable, making a more physical appearance in the fight. In other words, it takes a lot of energy to make the vibes right where it's willing to come out. Making use of these is a major effort, and the library's receptions last only for a few seconds and regularly needs to be recharged with more emotion after its use. But what separates it from all other kinds of ego is that any person that's aligned with the library can use it as long as they're in the right floor. Now, it's actually a funny case where one person's ego is what allows for dozens of other people to make use of other ego. That itself makes it pretty unique if you ask me. While we're at it, let's stop teasing and give y'all the final kind of ego, which the Limbus onlys are the most familiar with. Limbus Company's Center Ego are the 6th and final we know about as of now, and they can be split up into 2 subcategories. There's the base ego and the mirror ego. And to talk about the mirror ego, we need to make a final detour to explain a little topic I like to call the entire multiverse, also known as... This topic can and should take up a whole video, so let's keep today's version simple. Remember how the original river was called the primordial sea of possibility? Well, that extends to worlds beyond since multiverses exist in the world of Project Moon. They're called mirror dimensions, mainly because the main way they're witnessed is through technology that works and acts like mirrors. And ever since they were discovered by innocent beige scientists and others, people started to find ways to pull matter from the other mirror worlds into our own. 2 of these inventors decided to try and merge one of these mirrors with a bus that runs on green blood feast and made a way to extract possibilities from other worlds. While we don't know exactly how these work, the ego that are extracted are given to sinners that have something in common with the abnormalities they belong to. That's probably because Mephistopheles has an easier time pulling from possibilities that reflect more likely timelines, though that rule seems to be tested more as time goes on. Much like other abnormality-based ego, they work by making the emotions or identity of the abnormality their own, borrowing their power by walking in their shoes. And in practice, these abnormal psychoment-based ego, as the LCA calls them, work in a similar manner to the library of Ruina ego, costing sin resources and SP instead of direct light and emotion. Like those ego, they only last for a moment, but they come with their own perks and risks. Unlike the library's ego, these can be used anywhere and more often since sin resources are more plentiful to generate and SP is functionally infinite. The only downside of not having enough SP is that the ego will risk the sinner corroding and playing a game of friendly fire instead, though sometimes even that can be turned into the LCB's favor. The point is, once you incorporate light with enough technology in the existence of mirror dimensions, the exact mechanics of how ego work get much more complex very fast. So I can't really blame anyone that's trying to explain the PM power system for leaving it to the essentials. But since we've come this far, I'd like to ask you to now imagine a kind of ego that has all 3 of these traits and has that last Project Moon seasoning, LTNC. Little to no context. That is how you get the base sinner ego. Now, I'm not complaining about the lack of info. Back in the pre-Limbus days, you'd be lucky to get context that was in coherent English, let alone comprehensive. But we know next to nothing about the sinner's own ego other than their efflorescent ego in that they can be manifested at will, like mirror ego since they take sin resources, like volatile ego since they don't stop the sinners from corroding, and like the ego gear since they don't need any kind of interaction with Carmen to exist. And while these comparisons are fun, all else we know about these is that they're likely the sinner's own since no abnormalities exist to reflect them. We'll probably see more over time, but the facts are, this is all the info we have right now. And as it stands, the same's true for other parts of PM's power system. The golden Boughs, the mirror dimensions, and the sign. They're all different enough that they may need their own tour, but it's hard to say that they're the exact same system. So with that, I am happy to say we have finally made it through every single facet of Project Moon's light-based power system. That's 6 flavors of ego, 4 flavors of distortion, 3 kinds of technology, and if I had to guess, 600,000 people starving in District 19. What, did that estimate upset you? Then maybe it's time you manifest your own life and get the hell out of here! Thanks for coming by, but this ain't some kind of parasocial interaction. I'm Tap Dry, my editor sure as hell is. How about it, son? How you doing? Yeah, that's what I thought. So, how's about I get back to my special door, throw you the member and patron Q&A, and then you can make peace with whatever doubts are in your own head so you can seize that ego deep within. Yeah, I bet that sounds good. So what we got here? Alright, today's question comes from Jet7172. What do you think each of the sinners' favorite food would be, and what do you think they would bring to a company cookout? Just to make sure this fits within a minute, and because we talked about him a good deal today, let's just answer this for Vergilius. Now, I'm sure there are some deep cuts that I'm just not thinking of at the moment, but if I had to think of something he would bring to a company cookout, I think at the very least, an Italian apple cake. Not pie, but cake would cross his mind. In all likelihood, he would probably just find whatever delicacy is around or whatever's the easiest and bring that to fill in whatever gaps there are at the barbecue, but I don't know, I just like the idea of apples staying on his mind.